Hi, Vanessa. Thank you so much for joining me today. You are called, well, you maybe have named yourself the Grateful Guide, and I love that name, but I was also kind of curious about how that came to be and how you ended up becoming the Grateful Guide and what your journey has been to doing the work that you do in supporting people through chronic illness.
Yeah, so I coined that name or came up with that name years ago when I was first really sharing my journey into chronic illness. I have a long history with debilitating chronic illness that goes back to 2009 was really when I really kind of crashed and started to experience physical symptoms. And I mean, it was a really long journey of advocating for myself, of going, through specialists and doctors to find answers, never getting answers, just periods of immense hopelessness, despair, grief. I was bedbound for years. At my worst, I was hospitalized, unable to eat, unable to go to the bathroom. I just had lost all capacity. I couldn't stand or even sit up without losing consciousness. I had, everything from full paralysis of my stomach to debilitating neurological symptoms, just a lot of the chronic type illnesses. And I collected those yearly from like 2009 until 2017 was when I hit rock bottom. And throughout those years, I had two beautiful kids somehow. That was really difficult, but I just kept persevering and trying to look for answers and trying to find hope essentially.
Mm.
And for many years, I didn't find it. And I just got sicker and sicker. And there was a point, there were two times where I actually faced my own death and actually flatlined and just got to kind of experience something that was pure peace for a moment. And I remember when they brought me back to life, I was devastated because I just didn't want to be here. So there's a long history. I mean, I could talk for hours on the amount of traumatic, events that I went from a chronic illness perspective. But I will say that because I didn't give up on myself and I kept searching, even though the doctors told me, you just have to accept this, you'll never heal, you're going to be just get used to like a wheelchair or being bedbound for the rest of your life. I was like, no, I can't believe that. And have a really strong faith, which I actually found through this journey. So I wasn't faithful before. And, I really do believe that faith helped guide me to what I did to heal, which was I started to use the power of neuroplasticity, the brain's innate ability to change and rewire based on learning and experience. And using my brain and rewiring it and really just doing these consistent practices daily, I started to rewire and I started to interrupt the chronic stress cycle that I was in. I began to regulate my nervous system through somatic work and vagus nerve work, and my body started to heal. And so I've been kind of chronicling this journey on Instagram for years now, since probably 2019. And I started with gratitude. So that's hence the name. It's like, okay, what can I be grateful for today? Even though, life was pretty, hard. It felt like I was living in hell. I did my best to even look for the smallest things I could be grateful for. And so that's kind of how I came up with the grateful in my name. I used to be called the Grateful V. And as I healed and, really came into my true self, I started to guide others and I found people, really asking for help. And I was, certified as a bereavement educator, during this time in 2017. I do have experience working with people, and I felt, this was another natural extension for me of, helping people through chronic illness because there are layers of grief through that as well, but just after you've been through it and lived a decade in that state, you feel like you want to help everyone and just like, let them know like you don't have to stay, this sick, and there is hope. There are ways to help regulate your nervous system, and there are ways that you can heal and recover, and even if you don't get to 100%, you can improve, right? You can get your
Mm.
quality of life back. And so that's pretty much what I started to do. I started guiding people. I started to teach them what I learned, how I healed, and they call me like a hope rope giver in the community because that's what I do. I pride myself on like handing out hope ropes, kind of like Oprah, like you get a car, you get a car. And so that's kind of, what I've been doing for the past 4 years in the community as a coach, a guide, a hope giver. And so that brought me to 2021. I was, really recovered from the chronic illness, had gotten my life back, and then another perfect storm hit. And this is where the deepest grief showed up. So in November of 2021, my family and I caught COVID, and we had like the worst variant out there, of course, and it completely flipped our lives upside down. Within a week, my father was on a ventilator and in a coma. He was only 62, and I was in the hospital with double lung pneumonia, pericarditis, and an inflammation of other things. And suddenly, it was as if I had gone back to where I was, completely, debilitated again. And by week 3, my father passed. So we didn't get to say goodbye. We didn't get to be with him. We didn't get any of that. And it was a traumatic loss, coupled with this intense virus, which threw me back into a chronic dysregulation, and all of the symptoms kind of flared up. And I was suddenly diagnosed with like long COVID down the road. But I had just lost my father, and I'm a daddy's girl, like through and through. And, at every hospital stay that I was at, he was at my side every step of the way. He every morning showed up at my house, with a coffee. He took me and drove me to every appointment. Like he was there for me the entire time. I wouldn't have gotten through this if it wasn't for him.
Mm.
And suddenly I didn't have him anymore.
Mm.
And that just rocked my world because he was a pillar of safety in my life. And anyone who's lost a parent knows that when you lose a parent, it's like you lose safety. And the world doesn't make sense at that point. And so here I was on this new journey of immense grief. And even all the training I had done as a bereavement educator did not prepare me for this. And now I was navigating grief and chronic illness again. And
Mm.
so I slowly, gradually began to kind of implement some of the nervous system tools I had used in the past, and was able to recover from the long COVID pretty easy, not easily, but pretty early on, a couple of months in. But the grief, that was like a whole new animal. And yeah, and so the past 2 years, 2.5 years have been really this journey of understanding grief, getting to know it, making space for it, cultivating safety with it. It felt so terrifying, that emotion at first. I felt I didn't have the capacity for it. So that basically leads me today. And so what I do these days is I not only teach on the nervous system, but also on grief. And I have a membership that is for nervous system regulation and grief. And I really just feel like it ties in really nicely with chronic illness community, but also all loss, right? Like we could all use
Mm.
more resources. So that's pretty much what I do today is I share my story, and I help others move through some really dark times.
Mm.
Yeah.
And do you feel like your dad is still kind of very much part of your journey and part of the work that you do now?
100%. He's the reason I created it. This membership was inspired by him. I call him a philanthropist. We're Greeks, so there's a big Greek community in Toronto, and he was like a he was famous, we would say, right? He played this Greek instrument called the bouzouki, and he
Yes.
played in a band. And he every wedding, every baptism, it was like his band. Everyone knew him. He would walk into a cafe in the Greek town, and it's like, oh, it's George, it's George, right? Like, you're George's daughter. He used to do Facebook Lives every day. It's like he would just bring so much joy to people. And he always helped people who were struggling. And so, he would literally give you the shirt off his back, and both my parents actually. And I feel like that's, what I grew up seeing. And so, no matter how much I was struggling, I wanted to help someone else as well. And so he taught me that. And so he is literally the reason for creating what I created. And especially from the grief perspective as well, like, I dedicate it all to him. And every time I connect with someone through grief, I feel him. And I know they're still around.
I love
Yeah.
that. And I love that his name is George as well. It's so like such a
Yeah,
Greek name.
it is. It is.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I was wondering actually, what have you come to understand about what chronic illness is and how it shows up for people? Is it a clear, I guess because I kind of think, well, it's an ongoing condition that people are living with, but is there a clear definition around it, or is it just how would you
So there's
define it?
like there's an acute illness. Let's say you have flu and it does its thing, and in, maybe a couple weeks you're kind of back to normal. Or let's say you injure something, you maybe get in a car accident and you hurt your shoulder, and you kind of go through the physio, the tissue heals, and then you're fine. That's like an acute illness that would say that's not chronic. But let's say that same pain, that same shoulder is hurting you even after tissue has repaired and it's been months or years. Or let's say you go through a virus and clearly you're not sick anymore, but you're left with chronic fatigue. Suddenly you have anxiety, panic, you have GI issues. So basically, I mean, under that umbrella are so many things. It could be chronic pain, it could be chronic fatigue, chronic migraine, and these are many of the things that I was diagnosed with: dysautonomia, POTS syndrome, anxiety, panic, agoraphobia. So basically, anything that is prolonged and limiting you, and that, yeah, doesn't really have that acute phase or has passed the acute phase and is just lingering. So these are different varying degrees. So some may be more mild and people are still working, but they, have this neck pain, or they're still working and they have like an irritable bowel or whatever it might be. And then there's the other extreme, where you're bedbound or you're housebound, needing a walker, assisted devices. And yeah, so that's from the chronic illness perspective, what it might look like, but it's unique to each individual, right? So it can
Mm.
look very different from person to person.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And in terms of grief, I know that obviously the loss of your father was quite a significant grief in itself, but as you were living with chronic illness, is there a connection there between like having chronic illness and grief as well?
Yeah, most definitely. I like to see grief as tightly tied to all loss. So where there's loss, there's grief. And so if you think of chronic illness, there is loss of ability, loss of
Mm.
health. Most people who develop chronic illness have a background in trauma, which plants seeds for that sensitive nervous system. So then in trauma, there is loss of safety, loss of trust, loss of expectations, loss of dreams and hopes. And even chronic illness, you lose relationships, you lose friendships, marriages break apart. You lose your house sometimes, you lose your job, your finances, and hope. So there's a ton of grief in chronic illness that is very, very real. And I think that's something that most people don't even realize, you know,
Hmm.
that there is a deep, valid grief in chronic illness.
Mm.
And I think that's something a lot of us will bypass and just not even really think about. And that's really what I've been kind of on a mission to do recently in the chronic illness community, is to open eyes and, to the understanding that there is real grief here. And what can keep us stuck in our healing as well is bypassing grief, is not allowing ourselves to feel it and not sitting with it. And then I don't know if you want to talk about repressed emotions and how
Mm,
that can show up, but when grief doesn't get the opportunity to be seen and heard and witnessed and felt, it will show up in another way. And it may show up in addiction, it may show up
mm,
in chronic pain or chronic symptoms, chronic anxiety or depression. And so I found that in a lot of chronic illness clients that I work with and people in the community, that grief has not been given the attention it deserves. And
mm,
people end up kind of stuck,
mm.
right?
I was wondering about that because I think grief in general is misunderstood in society, but then when it comes to conditions that are also not obvious or not easy to see, then you might experience like a disenfranchised grief where there's no real acknowledgement. So then if
Yes.
society doesn't acknowledge it, then how do you realize that that's what you're
Yeah.
going through and that's what you're experiencing as
Yeah,
well?
that's such a great point. And I would say that a lot of chronic illness is invisible illness,
Mm,
right? And so, like you mentioned, and so you were right on when you said, if, well, I can't see it. For there was a time when I was in the depths of chronic illness, completely debilitated, but all I had was these labels of chronic this, chronic this. And people would be like, but what's wrong with you? Are you just dizzy, or are you just have a headache? And I'm like, no, it's this, this, and this. And you don't get that same understanding and compassion because people don't understand it. Versus and I'll share this, my husband had cancer early on in our relationship. And when you get, let's say, the label of cancer, there's grief that comes with that, there's a whole process. But it's valid grief. It makes sense. We understand it. We can say, ah, yeah, it's cancer, and it makes sense. And chronic illness doesn't necessarily have a label like that.
mm,
And I was talking with my husband about this at one point, and he's like, I don't know how you do it. He goes, with the chronic illness, because he's like, I, there was no acknowledgement and there's no answers, then that must be so hard. Right. And he's like, I'd rather go through what I went through than have what you're going through. So I was like, oh, interesting. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I used to pray, I wish I just had something that people understood. And so I
mm,
could get the permission to
mm,
grieve so that I could receive the compassion and understanding. And there was grief in that too, is like, no one's checking in on me, no one's calling, no one's really asking.
mm,
And that was hard too.
mm. And so, how did you start working through that and giving yourself, I guess you had to give yourself permission to grieve as
Yeah,
well?
so funny enough, I mean, I don't really think I grieved the chronic illness
Mm,
until I had kind of gotten to a point where I was feeling more healed. As I was going through it, I mean, yes, there were times where I was in despair and hopeless, but I think it was just me being, struggling in that moment. I feel like as I progressed and got better, that's when the grief surfaced to heal.
mm,
And I grieved, like I realized I missed out on like most of my children's lives. I was sick for most of their life. I don't remember half of their lives because I was in such a debilitating state of survival that I have no memories, very foggy memories. And so I'll have to look back at pictures and think of, wow, I don't even remember that. Like I was there for that. And so there is another layer of the grief of motherhood, is, and also realizing that because my kids grew up with a mother who, I mean, the ambulance had to come take me multiple times. They saw a lot of things that they shouldn't be seeing at their age, that they also developed a nervous system that was in survival as well. And so then now dealing with the repercussions of that, of helping them now understand and process trauma and the
Mm.
grief that's coming up for them now because they feel safe enough to process it now. So, so many layers. And I mean, for myself, I love somatic work. I was working with a somatic experiencing therapist. I love the work of Dr. Cheater Levine
Mm.
from a trauma perspective. And I think that was really important for me to go through. And so I learned somatic work and I started to build emotional intelligence just to start understanding how emotion shows up in my body. It was a whole new skill for me because I was an emotional repressor from like, years, right?
Mm.
So for myself, feeling had to be titrated. I had to slowly go there, almost like incrementally train towards feeling heavy emotions. Otherwise, it'd be too overwhelming for my nervous system. So, a lot of supporting of my nervous system, somatic work, journaling,
Mm.
praying, talking to my dad, just going through all of that. There's so many different ways that I was able to connect to my grief, listening to podcasts, reading books. And then we did that wonderful training, you and I, with Paul
Mm.
Denniston, the grief movement, which I think was so transformational. So I feel like there isn't just one way to do this. I
Mm.
feel like our grief is, as unique as our fingerprint, and we all kind of do it differently. But I do believe that there are some foundational resources that can support, all of us on this journey of grief. So yeah, it's just been, a few years of me really learning that, and obviously taking on from my training as a bereavement educator and all that I learned there, and just kind of piecing everything together really in a way that felt authentic to me. And I mean, as you know, I know your mom's passed when you were younger, but that grief never goes away,
Mm.
right? Like it's there, it's always going to be there. And I feel like we see it in different ways. It changes as we change. And during different milestones and different experiences in our lives, it kind of shows up in a different way. And you're like, oh, and so it feels like, we're grieving till the day we die in essence, right? But it's also, and maybe we can touch on this later, but it's just also a beautiful transformational experience that I feel like really brings you to who you truly are. Like it has this way, and I don't know if you agree with that,
Mm.
of like stripping away the nonsense in your life and the, people, places, things that just don't serve you anymore. Like it just, picks up that veil, removes it, and it's like, this is what matters.
Mm.
All that other stuff, no. And so you change. It's like you're forced to change. You are never the same person after that grief.
Mm. Yes, I totally agree with that. And that's what I've experienced as well, through grief, that it really just highlights what really matters. And then you think, oh, all of these other things I used to worry about, they're
Yeah.
just so insignificant, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has a way of like anchoring you
Mm.
almost, right? As much as it shakes you and like pulls the rug from underneath you, it also anchors you to like here, right?
Mm.
Like you have no choice but to be here, right?
Yeah.
And kind of face that. It's definitely a wild journey.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what actually, you said that, even when you were at your lowest point, you still held on to hope, and you still found some faith. And so I was wondering what gave you hope during that time.
Oh, so maybe I can backtrack a bit, but after it was probably my worst point, my lowest point in my life. I had been in the hospital for, a month and a half, finally released in the care of my parents at the age of 33. I had to move back in with them. And at this point, I really did feel complete and utter despair. And at this point, I didn't have any connection to faith, I'll be honest, at that point. I was angry at God. I was like, if there is a God, then I'm sorry, but like, I hate you. How could you do this to me? I was just pissed. I was angry. And at that time, my mental health had completely plummeted, as you can imagine, like not being able to do anything. I can't be a mom. I can't be a wife. I can't, I'm literally a child again at 33. The only thing I could really pray was to not wake up the next day. And that is literally all I would pray. And my parents were the ones who held on to hope and faith. And so they begged me to come to church with them one day to have this like special prayer read over me by the priest. And I never went to church back then. Like it wasn't a place that I really, other than my like wedding and like, Christmas or something. But I eventually agreed to go to church with them one day, and they brought me, they physically carried me onto this altar, and it was like a regular weekday. Church was empty. It's just me, my mom, my dad, and the priest. And the priest laid his sash over me, and my mom was, around, my dad was around, and he just started to pray. Didn't even know what he was praying. Apparently, it was something for healing. And as he was praying, it was so emotional. Like my mom was crying, my dad was crying, I was sobbing. There was this moment of like surrender. And I had no expectations going into this, but something happened in that moment. And so I wasn't like miraculously healed. I didn't, explode with faith in that moment, but it was like a seed of hope was planted. Almost like some of the dark clouds moved and I could see the sun slightly. And from that moment on, that faith started to grow. It was just a seed and it started to grow. And how it grew was by borrowing it from others. I'm like, my mom and dad are believing for me, so I'm going to borrow their belief. My friend is believing, or my husband's believing for me. I'm going to hold theirs until I can believe for myself. And so it was that in a series of hope ropes, meaning I started to, follow accounts and people that had gone before me, people who had been through this and healed. And so then they became my lifeline. I borrowed hope from them. They gave out a hope rope and I grabbed on for dear life and was like, okay, I'll hope until I can, really believe in this. And that's what I even tell my clients is that, you may not start off with full belief, right? And it's okay to borrow from others. So look to the ones who've gone before you, right? Like I'm looking at you and saying, I'm only 2 years into losing my dad. You're many more years in and you're doing okay. And that gives me hope. And I know the grief is still there, but I also know that life will continue. And so that's really what helped me with chronic illness and with grief is looking at other people's stories. And that was evidence for my brain to say we're going to be okay. I know this doesn't feel okay right now, but we're going to be okay. And if they can do it, there's nothing so special about them that they can move through it. There's nothing so special about me that I can't move through it. And so that kind of belief really started to grow in me. And yeah, and that's kind of how hope and belief really came about for me.
I love that phrase of hope rope.
Yeah,
It's just like grab
so
onto
fun.
this until you
Yeah,
can. Um,
exactly.
I guess we talk about a little bit more about the transformational part as well. Through loss, I feel like, yes, I've become a very different person. And, I think sometimes people maybe don't like the person that they're becoming because with all the pain and the grief, it might for a while feel like you're getting worse, you feel it, you feel worse, you're not as content as you used to be, or you're not as, yeah, you don't have capacity to really, I guess, engage with life. And so I don't know, I guess what the journey is, but it sort of seems like, well, eventually it becomes transformational in a positive way as well. Even with the grief, we can kind of say it hasn't disappeared, but we're living with it in a way that's more meaningful or that's more purposeful and we're more present in our lives.
Yeah. I don't know if you've read any of David, I'm sure you have, David Kessler's books, but he
Mhm.
has the one called Finding Meaning. And I thought that was a really great read, just about basically how we learn to make meaning from, not how they died, not what happened to them, not from the loss itself, but from who my dad was. How can we kind of carry on what he did here, knowing that he still lives within me? And so every time, I kind of notice that, oh, I do this like my dad. Part of him is still living and carrying that on. And I know a lot of people have, done big things, right? They've lost certain people or they've suffered a trauma and they'll open a nonprofit or some sort of charity. And those are amazing, but it's also the little things.
Mm.
I have a friend who just created a website just for herself where she could post artwork that she creates that are inspired by her mom. And like, she doesn't share it with anyone, it's just hers. There's my mom who writes every day to my dad, and she's created this beautiful like journal of their love. And she's, writing their stories, love stories when they met and they were together since they were 14 years old, and they had like an epic love story, madly in love until still madly in love. The love never
Mm.
ends, right? But yeah, I mean, there's little ways that you can find meaning, and I feel like that's really helpful. And from a transformation perspective, I think that grief has a way of really helping us focus on what we want to do. I think for myself, it really, I mean, there's obviously days where we don't feel like doing anything, and then there's days where it's like this passion comes in you and this purpose within you, right? It's definitely a transformational experience because I feel like it kind of breaks you and then makes you. It like remakes you, if that makes any
Mm.
sense.
Mhm.
Right? It
Yes.
feels like it's completely breaking you, like the butterfly, the cocoon, grief cocoon, the name of your podcast, right? You literally disintegrate and parts of you are broken and you kind of turn into this blob, and that is that grieving process. And you have no clue what's going to happen on the other side of it, but you're going to be changed. You're going to
Mhm.
be completely changed. You're going to come out, you're going to grow with the grief, you're going to heal with the grief, you're going to change with the grief, and it's going to become a part of you. And I know, I mean, every person that I've kind of talked to from a grief perspective can attest to never being the same. And I think there's a reason for that. I don't think we should be the same after we lose someone so important and so pivotal in our lives. So yeah, that's kind of how I see the transformation, I guess, taking place. And I will add, when you open your heart to that grief, that struggle, that suffering, you're making more room for love in the world. I feel like I experienced joy more than I did in a way. It's like almost like it's elevated, it's exaggerated in a way. So it's like when you give yourself the opportunity to really feel the depths of grief, it's like you can feel the joy even more.
Mm.
You really cherish. You're like, I don't know when I'm going to have this moment again. Like when you're sitting there with your family and you're just enjoying a really good day and you're laughing, and it's like you pause and you're like, this is something I need to remember and bask in and be grateful for, because we don't know. Nothing is guaranteed. And we know that. And those of us who have been through loss can really understand that in a way that we may not have prior to the loss.
Definitely. I can totally resonate with that. You realize how fragile people are and how fragile life is. Going through so many challenging times with your husband and your kids as well. What has the process been like, and how have you kind of now you are at a different stage and you've found a way to work through a lot of what you were experiencing, but in terms of your relationship, like with your husband and with your kids, how have you navigated that, and how have you found ways to, I don't know, yeah, sort of process
Yeah,
things?
so yeah, so from a like with the chronic illness, I mean, I've been with my husband for 20 years now, and I got sick right before we got married. And so that was life changing. I mean, he married a woman. I was an officer, federal officer before getting married. I was really strong, fit, smart, independent, had everything. I could do everything. And suddenly I was completely dependent on everyone for everything. And so it's like when you marry someone, it's for sickness and health, right? But no one prepares you for how challenging it is for the roles to change from like husband and wife to caregiver and basically almost like a child in a way. He had to feed me, bathe me, take care of me, and same with my parents. Like it was like a family affair. My parents became the caregivers to my children, and so they would obviously not really ask me for much because I couldn't do much, and so it was like they had my dad and my mom as their parents as well when my husband was working. So it's a lot of stress and strain on the relationship, and it is not easy. And it's like, I've seen so many relationships crumble and buckle under this, and same with grief. But what I tried to do is to be honest with my kids. I tried to involve them in my healing as much as possible, and involve them in the practices I was doing and saying, this is what mommy's doing to get better. It would really help me if you gave me a hug. It heals me when you give me a hug. Just getting them involved. I got them involved with visualizing with me. I taught them some brain retraining stuff. We do vagus nerve and breathing together, and they knew all about mommy's brain retraining and all of her practices she did. And so I let them know what was happening, and I also let them know, that mommy was still here and that I was doing everything I could, and that everything, that will be okay no matter what happens. And I think the most important thing was having support through those times. So I had a big fat Greek family, like I had my aunts watching my kids when my mom and dad couldn't. I had my grandmother still. My grandmother was actually caring for my daughter and me at one point. And she's still alive now, which is amazing. But it was a family affair, and I'm lucky to have that because not most people don't.
Mm.
And when it came to the grief as well, I think it was really important because of a history of repression in like the culture, in like Greek culture. And we grow up like, oh, don't complain, don't talk about things, keep it to yourself.
Mm.
That I might need my kids to know that mommy's gonna cry, and it's okay to cry. And you don't have to stop me, you don't have to fix it. This is normal because I miss my dad. And so having that open dialogue, the open conversation, and letting them know it's safe to feel, and that feeling is helpful, and it helps us heal, helps us release. And that's been good. And talking about it.
Mm.
Just yesterday, we were going through my phone and we came across the video of my dad, and I just started bawling, and I'm just like, I miss my dad. And my daughter is like, I miss him too. And, she cried and I cried, and it's okay. And it didn't go on for hours. It was a few minutes, but, I think that was a healing moment, right? It's just
Mm.
another layer. And I think it's important for our kids to see that, to not fear it, to say, I'm not sugarcoating it. This is life. And that's another thing that they know very well.
Mm.
Life happens. Some people get sick. Things happen that are outside of our control, but we can control how we respond to them, how we perceive them, and how we move through them. And the best way we can do that is by supporting ourselves, asking for help, really using resources that we have at our disposal. And we, obviously I've come into my faith, so have they. And again, my husband was agnostic, so he didn't really have much faith, but through this journey now, he's developed faith as well. And so we will pray together and just connect through that, and we're all learning together. So I think,
Mm.
I guess my point for that is, we don't want to heal separate from our families or grieve separate from our families so much. I think it's important to grieve together as well, while also like knowing that, I can make time with a therapist if there's things, that I wanted to process, which I did. But yeah, I think what helped the most was really not disconnecting from them. It
Mm,
would have been easy for me to say, like, I'll do my thing and you do yours, and I'll be separate from you. But I feel like that would have brought more distance, if that makes
mm,
sense.
mm. Wow, sounds like an amazing journey. And since you actually brought up the thing around family and in a lot of our cultures, I think similar to mine, mental health is not really a thing, or illness is dismissed sometimes, and especially if it's not obvious, like if it's not a physical, clearly a physical thing where you've broken something, or you can't. Yeah. So did you come up against any misunderstandings or dismissal, and how did you deal with that within your own family or culture?
So, because I didn't have like a well-known like diagnosis, let's say, people just thought I was, they're like, oh, she's having a mental breakdown, or she's in depression, or we don't know she's got something with her stomach or something with her thing. And so, I would get from well-meaning people and aunts, they would, just say like, just be happy, just let go of the stress, just stop stressing. And I'm like, oh, with that easy, oh my God, I'm just gonna do that. It's just a flip, a switch I can flip. But little things like that, or just get better for the kids. I'm like, you think I'm trying? Or they would say like, just like the most weirdest things that were very dismissive. Oh, you just need to get out more. You just need to have more fun, and it's at this point where I was literally, in a wheelchair, confined to a bed, like unable to do anything. And I had to really let go of the need to prove something to them. And I had to let go of the need for their validation. And I had to just be okay with saying that I believe myself, my family,
Mm,
my immediate family sees what I'm going through, and that's enough. And I don't need anything else from them. And so I just kind of, ignored them and just said, whatever you're telling me is not helpful. I'm like, you have no idea what I'm going through, and you never will unless you go through it, and that's okay. Because if I hadn't gone through it, I wouldn't know either. Right. So
mm,
that's really, what I had to do is just be okay with them not understanding me. Right. And
mm.
yeah, so I'm sure you can relate. And even from the grief perspective, they're like, you're still crying, you're still grieving. Tell my mom all the time, oh, you should be over it now, or you've got grandkids, don't cry, or,
Mm,
just be strong. That's a big one. Be strong for your kids, be strong for your husband, be strong
mm,
for everyone. And I mean, that's just the culture though, right? It's
mm.
just the culture.
I
And
actually, sorry, you go.
yeah, no, go ahead. I'm
Oh
sure you
no.
have something to share.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking I got the opposite, where I wasn't crying straight away when my mom died, and I had people worried because I wasn't crying. And so I'd get people shaking my shoulders, go, it's okay to cry, you can cry. And I was just like,
Yep,
I
yep.
just don't, it's just
Yeah.
not happening. I just don't feel like crying right now, you know? Um,
Yes. Yes,
mm,
yeah. I actually got that as well from, funny enough, we all handle grief differently. So I'm sure
mm,
you, and I think you said you have sisters, right?
mm,
So it's like everybody processes it differently. And so you can see that in the family system.
yeah.
So my mom she can cry on, you can just even say, J, like George, she is just bawling, right? And then my brother is the complete opposite. He can't even, really speak of my dad. He doesn't
Mm,
even want, my mom wants to talk about him all the time. So you can just see these differences, right? And then there's me in the middle where it's like, sometimes I'm bawling, then the next minute I'm like, I feel numb, or there's some times where I really want to talk about him, and then other times I don't. So it's just so interesting that we all move through it so differently, and there's no wrong way to, do it per se. I think we all have our ways. But I always say, I like to stay curious and just be like, oh, that's interesting. but it's funny how other people want to fix your grief and they're like, you should be, crying, all the time. But then at this stage, you shouldn't be crying anymore. And you should take off, you should stop wearing black. They told my mom because she was wearing black as part of our culture for
Mm.
almost 2 years. Like, you should have only what the year mark, you should take it off, so everybody has something to say.
Yeah.
Everybody has something to say, and they're all trying to fix it.
Mm.
And grief can't be fixed. It's not a
Yeah.
problem to be solved. And I think that is at the core, the biggest thing we face in our world, really, that
Mm.
people are still trying to solve grief,
Mm.
right? We're still trying to fix it, and it's not meant to be fixed.
Yeah,
It's not a
definitely.
problem to be
Yeah.
solved.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think eventually you realize like, oh, it's because the people looking at you or the people, witnessing you are uncomfortable by how you choose to grieve or how you're not grieving or how you are
Yes.
grieving. And so they want to feel less uncomfortable by kind of
Yes,
trying to get you to do what they think you should be doing.
exactly. Exactly. It's more about them and less about you,
Mm,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that I
Well,
guess
we
also.
know, I'm sure you've learned about grief needing to be witnessed, right?
Mm,
And like,
mm,
so if you were to ask me what is the most healing thing you can do in grief is to have it witnessed. Really, that's what I believe. When you're able to have someone sit with you in it and not try and fix you or change you, that does not judge your grief at all, that doesn't assign meaning or create a story, but is just there to witness and mirror back to you the pain that you're experiencing. That is the most powerful thing that you could do for someone in grief. So if someone here is asking, how can I support, my friend or my family member or someone through grief, just witnessing it. You don't even have to say anything. You can just say, I see you, I hear you,
mm,
and I'm here. That's it. It's that simple. But not everybody has the capacity for that. And I understand that too. And that's why those of us who have been through it have almost a superpower where we
mhm.
can sit with someone in that darkness. And
Yeah.
we willingly go into it because we know what it's like,
Mm,
right?
yeah. Actually, it's so funny. I recently, yeah, created a post saying, grief gives you hidden superpowers, and
Yes,
one of them is that, like being able to sit with your own emotions, but also being able to sit with others, as they
yes,
go through it,
yeah.
which is like
And
a
I would
real
say, like,
gift.
that's, yeah, one of the gifts. You took the words out of my mouth. That's one of the gifts, right? Like we said, how does it transform you? Well, you can do
Mm.
this now. I bet you couldn't before,
Mm.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think that's a really nice kind of note to end on because I was actually going to ask you like what's one thing that you think listeners might be able to take away with them and do to support themselves and others.
Yeah.
But maybe I guess you've just mentioned about how people can support others in grief, but what's one thing that you might share for people to support themselves, whether with maybe they are going through maybe they are experiencing chronic illness or it might just be the grief part. Mm.
Yeah. So aside from having, what you're experiencing being witnessed, like that's important key. I think also making dedicated time and space for your grief, giving it the attention it deserves. And what I mean by that is, I started doing this during the chronic illness phase, and with my dad is putting aside this time, I call it my own grief session, and making that time intentionally to say, I'm going to sit with it here. And so within this container of time, I'm going to allow it to be what it needs to be without judgment, but with that curiosity, and I'm going to open my heart to it. And so that I feel like is is so important. And no matter what grief you're going through, loss is loss, right? And all loss has grief. And not all grief is traumatic, but all trauma has grief too, right? So many layers. So I would say give yourself permission to grieve and make intentional time for that grief, whether that means running a hot bath and just sitting in it and allowing, whatever it is to surface, whether it's, kind of making the time to go scroll through your phone and look at old pictures or listen to an old voicemail, whether it's journaling and writing something, or whether it's sitting with your body and somatically and just allowing for some of the process to move through you. Whatever way you do it, I want you to really follow through with it and say, I'm going to make this intentional time for this grief, because it deserves it and because I deserve it. Right? It's like loving yourself enough to go there and do that deeper work,
Mm.
essentially.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's been really, really life-giving to me and important. No matter how busy you are, really setting aside that time.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. I love that. So
Yeah.
Vanessa, how can people, I guess, connect with you and find your work?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, yourgratefulguide.com. And in my website, I do coaching as well and consultations. And I mentioned I have my membership haven for nervous system and grief. And the grief section specifically is basically a compilation of all the resources I've learned through my own education training and experience, that are supports for you on this journey. So it's not like a program saying you're going to do this and heal your grief. It doesn't work like that. But these are resources that can help support you process and connect to your grief and just learn to move with it, grow with it, and live with it.
Mm.
So that's one way. And you can also find me on Instagram as Your Grateful Guide, YouTube, Your Grateful Guide. And yeah, so all those fun places that you find people.
I will
Yeah,
I'll
that's,
add
I
all
think,
those.
yeah,
Yeah.
for
I'll,
sure, for sure. Yeah.
I'll add those in the show notes, but thank you so much for this conversation. I think there's a lot that people can learn and take away from it, and even just hearing your story as well is really powerful. So thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure, and it was nice connecting with you as well. I feel like I always have a soft spot for fellow grievers in in the world, and I feel like we all share this unspoken bond.
Mm,
And right, I feel like and so I'm just really honored that you asked me to come on here. So thank you. Yeah.
thank you. I'll stop the recording.